Hello, my name is Kyle Myers, and in my presentation today, I am going to look at the idea of subject and object, beginning in Plato and ending in Hegel, showing how self-consciousness is the precondition for consciousness. Now, Platonic idealism is where we begin this. Plato posits this idea that there are forms which are the more real, most real reality of objects, that they are transcendent and they give the essence to objects, and that they are unchanging and eternal. Now, in the cave analogy, which is in Book 7 of the Republic, we all know this story about how the prisoner escapes the cave to find the world of ideas, which is represented as the world outside the cave. But what this highlights for us is that there is those things that are more real than what just meets the eye. The imagery that Plato uses to describe it is very vivid. It's very surreal. It talks about the sun. The sun represents the good that shines upon all of the forms. We could look at our modern world where people place their faith in the sciences. This really wouldn't be striking in Plato's day, of this naive taking of the world as being that which is most real. Plato is trying to identify something much greater beyond just the mere physical. But the question arises, how do we know these objects as epistemological truths? And further, how does the subject fit into this? Well, this is where we get into the Cartesian subject. Now, Descartes posits that he can be a radical skeptic, dismiss all objects of reality, and come to the conclusion that if I'm able to think it, then therefore I am at least a thinking thing. So at bare minimum, I'm a thinking thing, and then he brings back all those assumed parts of reality. But the problem is that what happens to this outside experience? Is outside experience just merely accidental, or is there a necessity to it? So in Kenneth Gallagher's book, Philosophy of Knowledge, he critiques Descartes, and he says Descartes should have realized that language is essentially social, and that it's not a creation of my ego, but it's inherited from me and from others. So Gallagher's critique of Descartes, it centers on this idea that we don't need anything besides the thinking self to know that we are a thinking self. That when language comes into the picture, that's when we realize that we can distinguish the I from the thou. It's a utility. It's a tool, language is, to know the other and ourselves. So, as a recap, Plato introduces this metaphysical idea that there are things that are greater, more real beyond us, and that these are just mere appearances that we are experiencing. Descartes, in his radical solipsism, questions the outside world, comes to this conclusion that I'm able to think it, so therefore I am, but discards that there is a relationship between the thinking subject and its object. So when we get to this recap of language, language is a bridge for the subject that distinguishes this from that, from I and not I, from subject and object. It uses the given language, whatever it might be, in order to distinguish, make note that I am not this. I'm not this object. I'm separate. And we give names to those things. And Aquinas knew this quite well. He speaks of this in the Summa. Gallagher points towards this Thomistic claim that the self is only known reflexively in the knowing of the non-self. What this must be understood is the relationship between the I and the not I, which grounds the subject. So we already are being shown in someone like Aquinas that we need the object to understand ourselves. Now, moving into the modern period, Kant radicalizes Descartes. He rejects Descartes' assumption that we can be a pure I, a solipsistic I. He tells us that the I must be able to accompany all my representations, for otherwise something that would be represented in me could not be thought at all, which is very true, that what we are able to think has to accompany this I think. The Cartesian I think accompanies my representations. So Hegel agrees with Kant that the self-consciousness is that which relates to objects in the world, and it's grounded in this transcendental unity of apperception, which is what Kant posits. But he believes that there's something deeper, something that drives self-consciousness to know its object. He asserts that consciousness, which has been historically assumed that consciousness is the preconditions for self-consciousness, but he inverts this and says, what if it's that self-consciousness are the preconditions for consciousness itself? So this is what Hegel would refer to as a self-relating negativity. So there is a dialectic that goes on, the dialectic of consciousness as desire. So self-consciousness has a contradiction as its fundamental form, where it has itself as a conscious object, but also itself as consciousness as such. The scholar Nicholas Garcia Mills claims that desire seems to be that which bridges consciousness as consciousness of objects and self-consciousness as a distinct object relating to itself. So desire seems to be a catalyst, a driving force that comes to know its object. So the relationship of consciousness that's aware of itself as conscious is only feasible with the other, going back to Kant, going back to Aquinas. So in this sense, Hegel is Kantian in nature, but when intuiting objects, the object cannot be distinct from my representations, as that is a necessary condition for what recognizes the I think, which it intuits. So again, going back to this idea of desire, Hegel does not believe that objects of consciousness are given to us prior to mediation. Rather, they are taken up in self-consciousness as an act of synthesis in a single manifold. Again, this goes back to Kant's transcendental unity of apperception. Hegel's use of words is to consume or to take possession of the object. So essentially, Hegel takes Kant to his logical conclusion using the TUA as a grounding for his system of self-consciousness, but only to insert desire as the heart of this complex argument. So Plato opened up this discussion for objects in the world and how we relate to them. His theory rests upon this idea of the eternal forms that essentially trickle their way down into appearances in the physical, but nonetheless we know these objects as objects by our interaction with them in the world. But Descartes radicalizes this, and he takes a solipsistic approach and says that I can only understand myself because I'm a thinking thing. I don't need objects of desire or objects outside of myself to know that I'm a thinking thing, and in fact it only clouds my judgment. But Kant sees this as an issue and asserts that there must be a unity of the I think with the object. And he calls this the transcendental unity of apperception that is a priori to all experiences. And so the Cartesian cogito proves to be insufficient for knowledge of the self due to its negation of the object that it relates to. So Hegel sees the Kantian formulation of self-consciousness as sufficient insofar as it reconciles the subject to its object, but Hegel takes it a step further when he includes desire into this equation. Kant saw reason as the barrier by which we can know the thing in itself, which is essentially the Platonic forms. But he believed that reason can only go so far, and that's where we reach this barrier. But Hegel inverts Kant by positing instead that reason might not be the barrier, but actually the vehicle by which we may know essences. We know essences through their appearances. Hegel writes about this in the Science of Logic. I have a quote here that highlights that. So what does this mean for the subject and object? Subject and object are inseparable. Subjective knowing relies on the other in order to know itself. Plato saw the essence of objects and the most true conception of objects as they relate to the world of forms. Descartes tried to understand the identity of the self devoid of object consciousness, while Kant introduces this unity of apperception in order to know the self. But I claim that Hegel, in a sense, we can look at it as him combining all three thinkers' ideas together to come up with the idea that essence only makes itself known through appearances, by claiming that objects of desire are known by self-consciousness and that the I presupposes consciousness as such. Hegel reconciles the history of philosophical thought on self-consciousness and its relation to objects in the world by introducing desire as its prime mover. Thank you.